Hey, Artnerds! Yesterday was Easter, and since so many of us are staying home and staying safe, I decided to paint a cute illustration just to kind of take note of the day and keep myself amused. So, I am painting this illustration on the Dora Art watercolor round. This is a cellulose-based watercolor pad originally from China, and I reviewed it a while back, so I'll link that down in the description below. And I wanted to draw my sketch using pink-colored lead so I could go for a lineless watercolor look. I wanted this to be a start to finish illustration with you guys, so that's why we're doing the sketching phase here. I know often I'll start in with a sketch already drawn. I did have the thumbnail, as you guys can see, off to the left, and I'm referencing that as I redraw my image with more detail, but I thought it'd be fun to show you guys my drawing process. So I start out by placing the main figure in this composition, Kara, from my comic 7-inch Kara. She's holding a basket of quail eggs that have been painted to look like Easter eggs, and she's going to be surrounded by daffodils. Once I have the main figure blocked in, I can start adding in smaller details like her face. For the lineless watercolor style, you're going to want to erase any lines you don't need once you're done using them. So if you draw constructively the way I do, that means you're going to be doing a lot of erasing and a lot of cleanup. As I sketch, I try to work progressively tighter. So now that we have the main figure sketched in, as well as the background daffodils, I'm erasing some of the extra lines and drawing in her facial features. I'm also tightening things up from the top down. So we start with the face and the hat and we work our way down, adding details as we go. I'm referencing a dress on my computer for this. I found a really cute children's Easter dress that I thought would fit the illustration really well. So even though it seems like I know what I'm doing, it's only because I'm working from some reference. This is a dress with 2 layers, so I'm tightening in the details on the lace layer first, and then I'm going to use that to kind of inspire the folds on the second layer. Once care has been sketched in, it's time to tighten in the details on the daffodils. Now I'm going to apologize because it does skip a bit here. Not really much for that. I have a how to draw flower series coming up on the channel, so if you're interested in learning how to draw flowers, that's a good thing to keep an eye out for. So here's our finished illustration. We've removed all of the extra lines. We've cleaned up the line art as much as possible. And we're going to get ready to paint. And we're painting today's illustration with the Core Mini palette. This is one of my favorite mini watercolor palettes. It's got 12 beautiful, vibrant colors, and I find myself reaching for it time and time again. The other materials you're going to need are a selection of watercolor brushes, a small palette, and a cup of clean water. So for today's illustration, I started by painting the daffodils and the grass in the background, and I began using a cool yellow color that I'm going to later mix with some phthalo blue to create a really bright spring green color. Now, generally in other tutorials like this one, you guys would see me paint the background sky first. I opted not to do that because I kind of wanted to freehand in some extra grass as I went, and I wanted the space to do so. I was hoping to catch the paper while it was still wet so we could get some nice wet into wet blending, but since this is cellulose paper, it does have a tendency to evaporate very quickly, so some areas dried before others. But I mixed in a little bit of phthalo blue with our cool yellow, and now I'm using it to add some shadows to the daffodil stems. Once I have the foreground grass painted in, I mixed in some more phthalo blue to give us a darker green, and now I'm painting in some of the background stems. Cool objects tend to recede into the background, and warmer objects seem to come forward, so the yellower grass is going to seem to come forward into the foreground. And you guys can see I ended up adding quite a bit of grass to this. The real difficulty is trying to keep your hands off the paper while it's still wet, as well as the gap that painting on a watercolor block creates between the paper surface and your desktop. So now that I've blocked in my grass and I've started to paint my sky, I used a really light mix of ultramarine blue to get the sky started. And Bowie wants me to remind you guys that if you enjoy the work I make here on this channel, one of the ways you can help me to continue to do these sort of tutorials is to join me over on Patreon. My boy loves eating Nutro, and to keep him in the style to which he's become accustomed, I could really use your support. So you can join me on patreon.com/natosoup. So you guys may have noticed that when I was blocking in the background, I did the large area first, and then I went back and did all the little fiddly bits in the background. I'm also painting Kara's hat white, so I'm using the same blue mixture to paint the shadows on her hat. Now that I have the sky and her hat blocked in, I'm going to start working on some of the other objects. So for the basket that she's holding, I mixed a little bit of Quin Gold with burnt sienna to give us this really nice warm straw color. I also used our same light ultramarine wash to start blocking in the white lace as on her dress. So it's like the little overdress or overlay over her dress. So it's going to be transparent lace. You're going to be able to see a lot of the yellow of her dress through the lace. So what I did is I just colored in the top area where it's creating shadow, and then at the bottom on the interior of the folds, and this is going to help create a sense of depth. Also went in and added another layer, a darker saturation to the basket itself. And I'm using another wash of the blue to add some more shadow to her hat, to the tops of her eyes, and to her teeth. Next, I go into the basket again with a really thick mix of burnt sienna. We're starting to add some of the darker, browner shadows to the basket. And then I want to go in and add another layer of depth to the sky. It felt a little bit too muted, so I go in with a much stronger mix of ultramarine blue. At the top of the sky, I really wanted to increase the saturation like you get on a really clear, sunny day. So I painted a really thick mix of ultramarine blue, and then I'm blending it out with some clean water to create a little bit of a gradation. Once the sky dried, I can start on our daffodils. So I mix a little bit of Quin Gold in with our cooler yellow to create a warmer, sunnier yellow. And I'm painting in the petals. It's a little bit difficult to see, but I am leaving kind of rim highlights of white toward the tops of the petals just to show the sunlight hitting the petals. I'm also using this same color to start painting her dress. So to capture the transparency of the lace, I'm painting the yellow underdress through the lace about halfway down using long brush strokes that end in a sharp point to kind of indicate that we can see the color in the folds of the dress. Then I'm going to go ahead and fill it in the bottom. And once our first layer dried, I'm going in with a second layer of the mix to start building up saturation. Since I have the majority of the colors kind of blocked in at this point, I'm going to start adding in some details to the daffodil leaves and stems. And I'm doing that with just a thicker mix, a more saturated mix of the phthalo blue and yellow mixture, working slightly darker. I'm also applying some of the ultramarine blue to the eggs. I'm using this as a shadow color, and then I'm going to paint the colors I want on top of it, so I'm not trying to glaze shadow on top of my color. This paper does not take layers well at all, so you want to be kind of strategic in how you layer on this paper. The Dore Arts field test captures this really well. So for her skin, I'm using some very watered down burnt sienna as our skin tone, and I'm trying to paint mainly the shadow areas of her skin, leaving a really strong rim highlight of white. It dries really light, so I'm going to want to go in later and paint another layer onto it. For the violet, I've applied a little bit of dioxazine purple. I'm blending it out with a little bit of clean water, and then I'm going in with a really saturated dot that diffuses out into the flower. For the centers of the flowers, I've mixed a little bit of yellow with a little bit of the pyrrole orange, and then I dabbed a little bit of pyrrole orange wet into wet and allowed it to diffuse. This isn't the final color, it's just the base color. I'm trying to make sure the throat of the daffodil is darker than the rest of it. Once that initial skin layer is dried, I can go in with a more saturated mix. If I'd been strategic about it, I would have made it much more saturated and just captured the base shadows, so we would have ended up with a piece that doesn't feel quite so overworked. I also apply first a very light wash of alizarin crimson, then I dab in some more saturated alizarin crimson wet into wet and allow it to kind of diffuse to create blush on her cheeks, on her lips, on her elbows, and on her fingers. To start adding some shadow and definition to our yellow, I start working more with the Quin Gold to add in some shadows. For the interior of her mouth, I mix a little bit of alizarin crimson with quin magenta to make kind of a darker red. And then for her hair and eyes, I'm working with a much more saturated mix of burnt sienna to start. And I'm trying to make sure I leave plenty of highlights in the hair, leaving the white of the paper still visible. Now it's time to add some freckles. So I'm using a more saturated mix of burnt sienna just to add little pepper spot freckles on Kara's face, her neck, her arms. You guys will be able to see that in a minute when I move my hand. And I'm also going into her hair with a mix of burnt umber and burnt sienna, giving us a warmer, darker brown to start adding in some shadows to her hair on her eyebrows and on her on the irises of her eyes. I'm also doing a bit of inking with watercolor, so I'm using a darker, more saturated version of the local color to create an inked outline using a finer watercolor brush. Initially, I had hoped that this would be enough, that I could just leave it like this and that it would add enough contrast, but the pink is really strong and it shows up a lot, particularly in the yellows. And while that isn't necessarily a problem, that might be something you find you like in your piece, that's not necessarily something I wanted to be so prevalent in my piece. So even though I did an initial watercolor inking using saturated versions of the local color, I do end up going over this piece again with inks later on. This watercolor inking stage does allow me the opportunity to kind of tighten up the illustration, add more shadows, and add more contrast. And it's also going to make the necessity of going in and doing a heavy ink job way less likely. So that's one of the things I like about this lineless watercolor style, is I have a lot of freedom to what degree I want to finish my piece and how I want to finish my piece. So to push the lace effect on the dress, I used the ultramarine blue mix to add some dots and shadows. So this would be like if you're looking at eyelet lace, you have some areas that are raised. Those areas would be painted in a brighter white to stand out more because they're catching the light. So then, of course, they would cast a shadow. So the ultramarine blue represents the shadow that those areas are casting. So once I finished watercoloring this piece, I gave it a chance to dry, and then I pulled out some ink pens. Of course, that's not going to happen for a moment yet. There's the transition, and there's the ink pens. So these are the Tombow Fude no Suke pins. They come in a variety of colors. I'm actually using brown for this one. I decided on a brown rather than going with local color or inspired by local color because I was afraid that if I went with local color, the color selection I have with my Tombow Furenosuke pins is not quite nuanced enough. So I decided to just go with a unifying color. And brown is much lighter than black. Brown also gives it kind of this nostalgic feeling. So we're still able to keep kind of this sunlit look. It's much lighter than if we inked it with black. Black would add a lot of contrast to this, whereas brown doesn't add that much contrast. And brown, just in general, is a good unifying color when we're working with yellows and we're working with skin tones. After I finished inking, I pulled out some white gouache, and I'm going to use this to add some highlights, but also to add the white eyelet details on the lace part of her skirt. So now that we're nearly finished working on this illustration together, I wanted to point out that this has been time-lapsed several times. I would say time-lapsed by about 8. So we've managed to condense about 6 hours of leisurely painting, playing some Animal Crossing, doing internet stuff, into about 47 minutes of video. So if you don't paint that fast, please don't beat yourself up because nobody paints that fast. It's really just not possible. But since we couldn't go out for Easter, we can't go out and see one another for Easter, you can't necessarily go out to church for Easter, I definitely wanted to do something because staying home, staying in all day, you start to lose track of days and then the depression really starts to creep in. So I think it's important to find ways, for as long as we're staying home, to find ways to observe and celebrate holidays in a way that's meaningful and enjoyable for you. So I wanted to paint an illustration because usually when I'm working on Kara stuff, holidays just kind of pass me by. I don't get a lot of a chance to make holiday-inspired Kara illustrations, save for like October, Halloween, and December. So this was fun for me. I don't normally get to do Easter illustrations with Kara, and I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to check out more of my art, you can find it at instagram.com/natosoup, and if you're interested in reading this comic, you can read the first 6 chapters as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com. I'm working on kickstarting Volume 2. You can sign up in the newsletter link down below for more updates. Thank you guys so much for watching.